First of all, traditional way to start presentation, lowering of expectations. I am not what you would call a hardcore Xinjiang specialist. I'm actually a medical historian originally, but because my interest in the labour movement in China is mainly independent trade unions, and because trying to form independent trade unions in China is an interesting experience, which does not usually end well involved, I've developed a general interest in human rights and how the PRC government deals with dissent and unrest, and naturally that leads you to religious and ethnic dissent and unrest, so that's kind of how I've got to be in the neighbourhood. And the other thing is I just happened to be in Routledge this January and had a look around some of the key neighbourhoods that were involved in the unrest. And when it all broke out in July, I mean, I can't say I saw it coming, but once it happened, I was not in the least surprised the way it developed, because the fault divisions were extremely visible in that city before, and it really was only about before something happened. I know you've actually had, some of you have had a chance to look at it. You're trying to focus books, it's giving me a lot of background. I've been through a little bit myself anyway. I'm guessing most people know who China is, but I just want to show you Xinjiang and Routledge, their capital. Other places I might mention, Gulja, there was a major uprising there in 1997 that I'll mention in passing, and Kashgar, which is in Chinese, we also get a mention. It might look like a lot of distribution of major areas around there, but you can see why. The desert is in the middle. These are old Silk Road oasis cities, through which Chinese silk used to pass on its way to ancient Greece and Rome, although there's been water on the bridge since then. So Routledge, of course, is the provincial capital. Long way from Beijing, and sometimes that means free and easy provincial government can do what it likes. No, not in Routledge. Very militarised, very controlled. You can probably see China's biggest province, but not very many people there, about 20 million. Up until CCP came to power, almost entirely Uyghur. Various other ethnic groups, some of whom are still there. The big influx of Han Chinese has been in the reform period, and especially from the period. And as you can see, there's still not a majority there, but actually in urban Xinjiang they are, and in Urumqi they're a big majority. There are about only 450,000 in the city. Kashgar is much more a Uyghur city, but Urumqi is definitely not. In fact, you can spend whole days in Urumqi, especially if you go to the posh bits, and you wouldn't really know you were in Xinjiang, or you wouldn't know you were in an ethnic minority area. The provincial territory, the autonomous region, has never been independent as a whole, and actually, its independence was always relative. There was something called the Republic of East Turkestan briefly in the 30s and again in the 40s, or Uyghuristan, some people. But especially the one in the 40s, it wasn't so much independent of China as it was leaning much more towards the Soviet Union. It's one of those unlucky territories stuck between two major empires that kind of gets the worst of both sides very often. So that independence should probably have inverted commas around it. And then it was, as your leaflet says, peacefully liberated by China in 1949, and they never let anyone forget what a wonderful event this was, and I'll come on to that and show you some of the physical signs and some of the pictures later on. Because it's majority, ethnic minority, you know what I mean? It is an autonomous region, and that's a little quote there from the relevant Chinese law. If you're in an autonomous region, whether it's a county or an entire province, as in this case, the minorities have the legal right to carry forward the fine traditions of ethnic cultures and to preserve or reform their own folk ways and customs. And that means they have the legal right, in theory, to adjust Chinese law to fit in with, what suits their particular circumstances. In practice, well, especially in the Mao period, it doesn't mean very much in terms of cultural autonomy. Even the basics, like the right to use your own language and to have access to education in it, is really quite limited. And any overt expressions of ethnic identity in the Mao period, like in 100,000 in the mid-50s, for example, was stamped on very hard. In the reform period, though, it looked as if there might be a new and better deal for ethnic areas. In 1981, an exile Uyghur who's based in Turkey, which is where most of them were into the mid-90s, met a Chinese delegation in Ankara and made this appeal for some religious and cultural concessions, honestly about population. In other words, admit that you're moving in loads of Han Chinese and admit the effects this is having. And to work towards economic inequality between the two major groups. It was worth trying that in the early 80s, because if you look at Tibet around the same time, the new government under Ban had sent a delegation out to Tibet to look at conditions there, which had actually turned in a very honest report to the central government. They expected to find happy new socialist Tibetans who were pleased to see them and who hated the Dalai Lama. And when they let representatives of the Dalai Lama in, they were mobbed everywhere they went by people who were delighted to see them. And, they drew conclusions from this, and for a short time anyway, made some significant concessions, especially cultural ones, in the direction of more use of the Tibetan language in education. So, I mean, back in those very early years of the reform period, it did seem as if lots of things might be possible, and it was always worth having a go at things like this, which I think in hindsight you think, well, what was he thinking? But, you know, at the time, the atmosphere was very different, and things were sort of up for grabs. Didn't come to anything though. The Chinese delegation actually never even replied. The Chinese government never replied to those demands, and so they were just left hanging. The unrest in Xinjiang, it bubbles along all the time. It went on all through the 1980s, but from 1990 onwards, roughly, you can start to see the influence of the Mujahideen from next door in Afghanistan. And then you can start to talk about, not quite an Islamist uprising, it's not kind of well integrated with that kind of movement, but there is some influence. Various uprisings like listed there, the Baraman Guljar one was big. If you look it up and try and look for casualty figures, most people will say in the tens or maybe the low hundreds, but we just don't know. The trouble with these goings on in the more remote and militarised parts of China is lack of independent witnesses, mostly independent media and so on. So we're guessing about a lot of these. 1996, China started cooperating much more closely with its neighbours, dealing with this whole problem of Islamic insurgency around the stands and the border with northwestern China. Basically, their problem was they all had restive Muslim populations, and they all tended to base themselves just over the border in the neighbour's territory for safety. So they all had to cooperate to kind of squash each other's insurgencies, and then somehow it would all work out. It was called the G5, but there are 6 of them now, so they're the Shanghai organization. Basically, China, Russia, and the stands. Who's missing from there? Turkmenistan. I don't know why they're so standoffish, but apparently they are. They haven't joined yet. And that group combats the 3 evils, so they're not leaving us guessing what they think about this stuff. International terrorism, separatism, and religious extremism, and they do tend not to separate those. And if you put them all in together and you have terrorism in there, clearly this means you're not going to have you're not really going to want to listen to claims for greater religious freedom, because it's all being rolled into that. Separatism, splitism, as it's often known in China, is also a serious offence or an evil as far as China is concerned. It has been a violent uprising. There have been terrorist incidents, you can rightfully call them that. But there's nothing confirmed ever outside Xinjiang's borders. In fact, they kill their own people sometimes, which is rather sad. Bus bombings in 1997, that was after the Guljar uprising was put down. There were a number of deaths there. August 2008, right before the Olympics, you probably remember, the attack on a group of Chinese police very early one morning when they were out for a run, 16 of them were killed. There were rumours, well, the Chinese government reported that they had foiled an attempt to blow up a plane from Urumqi, heading east. I don't know if it was actually heading to Beijing, I can't remember. It was the plot, you may remember, with the soft drink cans filled with explosives. They only reported it apparently weeks and weeks after it happened, and I don't know, possibly I'm overly cynical, but then, you know, I'm British, so I've been lied to about terrorism and weapons of mass destruction by experts like Tony Blair, and I take all of this with a big bucket of salt. So I personally am not convinced they've ever managed, if I can put it that way, to project force outside Xinjiang's borders for terrorists. So they're not backward as terrorists there. So it is a violent movement, more so than Tibet, where the Tibetans aren't completely peaceful. People just think they are because they're Buddhist and Catholic, and people don't have that image of Muslims anymore. However, the way in which it's been dealt with has been extremely violent, and I don't just mean in terms of executions, I mean extrajudicial killings. But Xinjiang does seem to account for quite a high proportion of the known executions in China. I mean, we're guessing because, again, that's a state secret, but the law professor who said a couple of years ago that before they changed the law so the Supreme Court had to ratify death penalties, which it does again now, it may have been as many as 10,000 a year which is more than the rest of the world put together. I think it's absolutely huge, even for a large country like China.